Welcome to What Are You Sporting About podcast, a podcast about business, employment, sports, and entertainment to help educate, support, and guide you to your next level. Here's your host, attorney Savania De Barros.
Hi guys, this is Savania De Barros, the protector of athletes, and I am back again with another episode of What Are You Sporting About? And today I have the pleasure of sitting down with attorney Michael Kaplen, who's a partner in the brain injury law firm. And that firm is Caro Kaplen LLP, which is located in New York. Now, I have to tell you just a little bit about him, and then we're going to dive right into it. So attorney Kaplen is located in New York, and he represents victims of traumatic brain injury and other injuries caused by vehicle collisions, pedestrian, unsafe buildings, and construction sites and medical malpractice throughout the nation. He's also been practicing in cases of brain injury as it relates to athletes. So I definitely wanted to have him on this platform because I really feel like he has a unique voice and expertise. I'm also a lawyer, so I love learning different things about the law and how people can utilize the law for their benefit. So welcome to the stage, attorney Kaplen.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I look forward to our chat today.
Yes, absolutely. Is there anything else you want to add to your biography for the people who are listening?
Well, the only thing might be pertinent to what we're going to be talking about is my partner and I filed on behalf of the Brain Injury Association of America the appeals to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court, challenging the NFL settlement as not being fair or dealing with the brain injuries that have taken place to the majority of players. And although we weren't successful in those appeals and the settlement was approved, it turns out that we were more right than we even thought we would be about what has happened to that settlement and what has happened to players as a result of that settlement.
So what exactly has happened?
Well, the majority of the players, as we argued, are not going to be participating in this settlement, unfortunately, because the settlement only captures a small amount of individuals who have suffered from brain injuries. The majority of players have suffered from concussions, post-concussion syndrome, psychological manifestations of a brain injury, and they were not included for compensation in the settlement, unfortunately. And in fact, that's a serious flaw with the settlement. We pointed out that even for those who are included in the settlement is not what these players thought it would be. One of the best examples right now would be African Americans who have dementia and have been flagged in this settlement with unnecessary norms that are being used in order to determine whether or not they have dementia. We pointed this out in the beginning that this was just totally unfair. Unfortunately, the attorneys who were handling this case on behalf of the players weren't really representing all the players. And of course, the NFL really didn't care what happened to the players. They just wanted this case over and done with. But there are many problems with the settlement, and some of these problems still have yet to be worked out.
So let me ask you this. So we know, of course, just in our everyday life that there are certain things that you may be engaged in that could cause long-term health impacts. The dementia that you've been talking about, is that, or have you seen that as an onset, a medical issue because of, or resulting from, for instance, like brain injury for NFL athletes? Or is it something that, I don't know, like explain that part to me.
Well, brain injury and the effects of brain injury is on a continuum. because a brain injury is not an event like a broken arm that just heals in a short period of time. A person with a brain injury is going to have ongoing problems, unfortunately,
Correct.
for their life. And as they grow older and as that injury ages, there are going to be different problems that develop. Medical problems, endocrine problems, psychological problems, and of course, dementia. But dementia is just the last stage of what happens to a person or might happen to a person who has sustained a traumatic brain injury. Obviously, a person doesn't get dementia on day one or
Right.
1 year as a result of that brain damage. It's a process that evolves over time. And that's what I think, unfortunately, is missed in that settlement and is missed in people's understanding of brain injury in general, because brain injury, as I say, lasts a lifetime.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point to make. So, based on your experience of litigating these particular cases, and specifically as they relate to athletes, what is the earliest onset of brain injuries that you have seen? Like, has it started from an early age with children, or is it something that is shown to be more prevalent in the harder contact sports amongst adult athletes?
So I think I'm getting some feedback. I don't know what that is. Oh. I think your listeners need to understand that there are several components of a brain injury. There are physical problems that might develop. There are cognitive problems that might develop. There are emotional problems and behavioral problems. Each one of these realms is different and develops at different times and affects people in different ways. From a simple concussion, all of these different problems can develop. We can have physical problems such as headaches, dizziness, sensitivity to bright light or loud noises might bother the individual. They might have sleep disturbances. They might, as I said, have headaches. And these problems can develop within minutes, hours, or days following the injury, or some of these problems might take even longer to develop. You have cognitive issues, memory problems, concentration problems, impairment on the ability to do more than one thing at the same time. You're listening to me now, you're typing, you're thinking ahead to the next question, where we're going next. You might have something going on in the background that you're kind of tuning out as we're talking, but you're doing all of this at the same time. And a person who has a concussion, which is a brain injury, is not able to do all of that anymore. Their wires have become scrambled. And this sometimes doesn't become apparent to the individual, be it a child or an adult, until they go back to school or try to go back to work in their normal routine. That's when they start, they might have headaches to start with, they might have nausea to start with, they might have dizziness, they might be resting for a couple of days, and then try to go back to resume their normal activities. And that's when they find out that they have these problems. Now, there are other problems that might develop, emotional problems, behavioral issues, depression, anxiety, inappropriate behavior, saying the most inappropriate things at the most inappropriate times, that again may take some time to evolve and develop in the individual. So things can happen right away, as I said, hours, minutes, or things can take some time. And some things, when I say things, some symptoms might come, other symptoms might go. It's a moving target. But just because an hour after you sustain this concussion, you don't have these problems, doesn't mean that a week later you might not discover that you had these problems, or a month later, or even more other serious problems. Not that these problems that I talked about are not serious by themselves, but conditions such as a seizure disorder might take months or years to develop. So you could have a concussion today, and you could have a seizure as a result of that concussion in a month or in a year.
Wow. That's some good stuff to think about, because like I'm thinking too. So my mind automatically takes me to football because it's so much more of a contact sport. But what about soccer players, people who are constantly bunting the ball from their head? Is that impact strong enough to provide a concussion for the player?
The answer to that is yes. There's two components to that we have to talk about. One is repetitive head trauma, which happens as a result of heading that ball, but it also happens in football when the blow or the movement of the head is not serious enough to cause a concussion right then and there. But the repetitive nature of these injuries can lead to damage by itself. Just think of a young child who's a pitcher in Little League. Well, we count how many times they could throw that ball. There's a pitch count before we say no more. I'm sorry. You can't be pitching anymore in this game. Well, we don't have that kind of head count for how many times you could hit your head before we say, I'm sorry, you can't play anymore, although I believe that we should. So that's one issue by itself. The repetitive nature of the trauma can cause problems, even if they're what they call subconcussive blows. Now, I'm talking too much, so I forgot your question, but there was another part to it that we wanted to talk about.
No, I like that, because I was just asking, would that be the same for a soccer player who punts the ball from his head versus someone in football who it's really it's really an aggressive contact sport, and you were breaking down those two parts.
I got it now. I know where I went. Let's be clear to everybody listening, and this is important because as a lawyer, it's important in the courtroom to explain. It's important for me to explain to judges and to juries and insurance carriers that you do not need to hit your head on an object or being struck by an object to sustain a concussion. A concussion happens because the brain is floating within the skull in fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. And that kind of provides a cushion to the brain. And the brain is a very soft substance, sort of like jello. But the inside of the skull is a very rough area. It's hard, it has ridges, it has protrusions. And when that brain is moving in the skull, sloshing around forwards and backwards and to the side, it bangs up against the wall of the skull. And that's how the brain gets injured. And even if it doesn't bang up against the skull, the violent movement of that brain back and forth, the whiplash movement, causes the nerves to stretch and to break and to become injured. And there are chemical changes that take place in the brain as a result of that. And that's how this brain damage occurs. So it's very important for everybody to understand that you don't need to hit your head in order to sustain a concussion. The next thing that it's important for everybody who's listening to also understand is that you do not need to become unconscious in order to sustain a concussion. Those are two big myths. So someone thinks, well, this child didn't have a concussion because they weren't knocked unconscious. Well, that's just not true. If you have the violent movement of the head, if you have the head hitting the surface, if you have a child that looks dazed or confused or just kind of out of it for a minute, there's a good chance that that child had sustained a concussion. So there's a saying, it's my saying, when in doubt, keep them out, which means simply, if there is a possibility even that that child has sustained a concussion, or an adult playing some type of sports, and it doesn't have to be football or soccer, it could be baseball, you could get a concussion in any type of sport, many different ways. The important thing is not to allow that athlete to go back to play again until they are cleared by a doctor that it is safe for them to go back. The fact that the child says, or the athlete says, oh, I'm doing fine, I'm feeling great, there's nothing wrong with me. Don't believe them.
So that brings me to another question, because of course, in law, you can file your complaint for damages. In this sense, you would technically be dealing with personal injury. But you can also, as a defendant, file affirmative defenses. And the first affirmative defense that comes to mind, especially when you're dealing with professional adult athletes, is assumption of risk. So an organization can say, well, you assumed the risk for this sport, you knew the dangers that were inherent with this sport, and we shouldn't be responsible for any additional injuries to you based on that assumption of risk. What would you say about that?
I would say that's a simplistic way of looking at the situation. When it comes to the NFL, and in that case, I would frankly say it's a lot of bullshit. That's a legal term. The reason I say that is because it's not till very recently that we've come to know, the public, about all the problems that develop as a result of that concussion. But the NFL knew years ago what these problems are and misled these athletes that it was no big deal to have a concussion, that you could go back to play in the same game, that there are no permanent damages or results of those concussions. So the NFL misled these players, and you can't be assuming a risk if somebody commits fraud and takes you down that wrong highway. And that was the predicate for these lawsuits brought by these players against the NFL. You lied, you misrepresented the risk that we face. Well, that's a little different now, because what we're talking about right now is open and out there in the public, and public should know about the risk of concussions. But what about the responsibility of coaches, teams, trainers, in not allowing this injured player to return to the field before they've medically cleared? That's something different, because now you're exposing the player not to the initial risk of getting a concussion, but the enhanced risk of returning prematurely and getting a worse injury than what would have taken place if you allowed that brain to rest and to heal. That's not on the player. That's on the team that's responsible for this player's safety. What about teams that don't enforce their rules and allow reckless conduct to take place and allow unsafe practices to happen? Are you telling me that players assume the risk of that? I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. I don't agree that when you allow these children on a baseball field and you have pitching practice and hitting practice and all things going on at the same time on that same field, that this 10-year-old child assumes that risk of getting hit by a ball. I'm sorry. I don't agree with that. That might be what, the insurance company says, but hey, their job is to not deny, delay, and refuse to pay claims. My job is to represent the injured person and make sure that justice is done. So when that child is injured because of unsafe conduct, or because the playing field was not made safe, or because the coaches weren't doing their job, or they weren't given proper safe equipment or supervision, that's not, in my mind, assumption of the risk. It's a very different situation, and that transfers over to collegiate athletes as well. When the NCAA rules are not being enforced about allowing these young athletes to return to play, or allowing them to return to play prematurely, they didn't assume that risk. Something very different.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I love that explanation, because it provides, for me as an attorney, like, I understand exactly where you're coming from. And part of what you were saying reminds me a little bit of employment law. So I represent individuals in employment and labor area, like, a lot more. And in that area of practice, what we talk about are the policies and procedures. Is there something that you have done or not done that's created an injury to the client? And so I want to ask you something kind of like in that frame of mind, because you mentioned individuals that are part of the team not following certain protocols or procedures, or there is a space that's kept unsafe. Like, what have you seen in arguing these particular cases? One, what have unsafe conditions look like for an athlete? Just as an example, what has it looked like for an athlete? And then two, are there additional policies that you've argued that weren't followed properly? So we know you spoke before about the NFL being aware of these particular injuries, but were there additional things that different organizations should know of, and follow?
I'm laughing because unfortunately I've seen it all. And when I think I've seen it all, I'm surprised to find out that there's something else going on I didn't think of. Because, when you put profits over safety, when you're more interested in the game itself than the safety of players, when that's more important, the winning and losing, than the health of these athletes, all kinds of bad things happen. It's not only in the area of brain injury, it's just all kinds of injuries. And I could give you, as I'm thinking now, as we're talking of cases that I've handled, many different examples of it. I remember a young man who was playing basketball, and he was playing, it wasn't street basketball, but he was playing in a league that used to go in these big parking lot arenas, and they'd cover the surface with some kind of material, and they play basketball there. Well, what they covered up was some big holes in the ground. So this young man is running down, and of course his foot gets trapped in this, and he twists it, and he gets a bad knee injury and leg injury as a result of that. Well, he didn't assume that risk because he couldn't even see what was there. We've represented athletes that were playing baseball, and as I said, that the coach is out there hitting balls to these young players, and at the same time there's fielding practice going on, and nobody's paying attention to what's going on. And of course, one young man got struck with a baseball. And he sustained a brain injury. I just finished a tragic case that got to be a little circumspect about telling you about it because of some confidentiality issues. But this young man was in college, and it was a winter day, and they were going to an off-campus practice. And the coach told these young men to use their own cars rather than use a van that the school should have supplied. And It was a snowy day, and the practice should have been canceled, but the coach insisted that they go to this practice, even though there were winter weather advisories going on, even though the town had a 3 or 4 hour delay in opening their own facilities, and told these boys to go out on the road. And there was a tragic accident that took place, causing catastrophic injuries to my client. We sued that school and we sued that coach, claiming they had a responsibility to these young men to make sure that they didn't go out that morning in an unsafe condition for this practice. And we were successful in that case. But although we were successful, the tragedy still remains that this individual has this catastrophic injury. We've seen cases where schools and coaches allow a player to return prematurely, and tragedy happens. It's called the second impact syndrome. So the second head injury on that playing field isn't a concussion with some memory problems or concentration problems or headaches. It's a young adult who has a catastrophic injury and either can die as a result of that or be permanently disabled, requiring a lifetime of care. And we could go on and on and on with different examples of this happening because proper safety precautions aren't followed. And when it comes to a brain injury, it's very simple proposition. The best cure for a brain injury is prevention. So, make me very happy if I had less brain injury cases and these young adults lived a full life without an injury to contend with. But unfortunately, that is not objectively the way of the world right now, because these coaches are so hung up on the necessity to play, and they get so involved in the game itself that safety sometimes takes a back seat.
And let's face it too, because sometimes the parents are worse than the coaches, right? But I love that there is a huge awareness and awakening in the sports industry around athlete safety, because it's been happening for so long around these kids being injured. No one really stepping up to help the athlete to develop in more ways than just becoming an athlete.
Well, I agree with you. It's sad that brain injury has been under the radar screen for so long, and it's really a silent epidemic. If you look at statistics from the Center for Disease Control, there are millions, not hundreds or thousands, but millions of brain injuries, concussions that take place each and every year. It's really epidemic levels. And it's a tragedy because although many of these individuals have a good recovery, there is a significant group of individuals that don't have a good recovery. And we tend to forget about them and say, well, sports are a good thing and we just have to accept these risks. Yes, sports is a good thing. No doubt about it. There are a lot of benefits to engaging in sports. But having said that, that doesn't mean that you have to sacrifice safety at the same time. There's a balancing act. And if you can make it safe and prevent a child from being injured, then I think we all have an obligation to do that.
I agree. So let's say that an individual passes away from the injury that they suffer, whether it be brain injury or some other injury that eventually causes death to them. And the reason why I want to ask you this question is because when we are seeing wrongful death actions being filed, you may have other people who want to bring a wrongful death case for the person who's passed, but they may not have what we call proper standing. So when you file a case of wrongful death action, who has the proper standing to stand in the shoes for that case?
Well, every state is different. So I have to speak very generally to this issue and not misrepresent the law in different states. But the first proposition is that you have to have a relationship to the person who is injured, be it their spouse, be it their parent, be it their children. It can't be a stranger who seeks to benefit as a result of someone's death. You have to have that bond in some way with the individual. And each state gives that right to different people. And each state measure of that damages that can be recovered is different in a wrongful death case. Now, unfortunately, the state of New York has a very archaic law when it comes to wrongful death that says that the spouse or other loved one who's left behind cannot bring a lawsuit for their grief and the emotional turmoil that's taken place as a result of the death. Well, that's tragic, because that's a tremendous loss when you lose your spouse, when you lose your child. There's a great emotional impact that will affect you as a parent. There's nothing worse than losing your child, or as a spouse, losing your soulmate. But the law in New York doesn't recognize that loss. In New York, the only loss that's recognized is a pure monetary financial loss. It's called, the technical term for that is pecuniary loss. So we have to look at that in terms of dollars and cents, and how much of an economic loss the family has sustained as a result of the death of that individual. So if you have an elderly person who isn't working, you really have no financial loss. If you have a young child who's never worked and has passed away, you don't have that financial loss. So those cases, really, unfortunately, insurance companies and negligent people are getting away with murder, for lack of a better term. And that's not true in every state. I have to say that, but unfortunately, that is the law in the state of New York. Although children do have a right to bring a lawsuit for the loss of guidance of their parent, which can be a substantial loss in and of itself.
In New York, so if you were to file a personal injury claim for damage, for like injury, or you were to file a wrongful death suit, what is your statute of limitations, the timeline that the court mandates that you file an action by? What's that timeline in New York?
Well, a negligence case has to be commenced within 3 years of the date of injury. A wrongful death case has to be commenced within 2 years of the date of death. So those are fairly short periods of time, and there are other important time periods that have to be considered, because if you're suing a municipality or the state of New York, there are much shorter periods of time. If you sue the city of New York, you have to bring a written notice of claim within 90 days of the incident, and you have to bring a lawsuit within a year and 90 days. These are real traps for individuals. Now, having said all of that, these are very general statements that I've made, and there are exceptions to some of these rules, and there are other peculiar rules. So if anybody needs to think about bringing a lawsuit, they should do it sooner than later and consult competent legal counsel as soon as possible, because once the statute of limitations runs, you're just out of luck. There's nothing that you could do anymore in terms of bringing that lawsuit. So it's important that a person who's been injured seeks an attorney's guidance and advice as soon as possible.
No, thank you for that, because that is very, very important. And I think for lay people who don't have a legal background or understand law, there are so many different types of preemption rules that could derail an individual who think that they have time to bring a lawsuit, but they really don't. So thank you so much for saying that. Attorney Kaplen, this has been absolutely eye-opening for me. So there's a lot of information that I didn't even recognize as a lawyer. And I understand that the rules are different from state to state, absolutely from state to state. But I love the work that you and your firm has been doing on especially this brain injury stuff. There's still a long way to go. There's still a long way to educate all of these educational institutions and sports athletic organizations for the safety and health of athletes. And we're a long way away from getting there. Long way from getting there. But I just hope that the individual themselves, if they are an athlete, an adult athlete, and of course the parents of children athletes, really take the necessary steps to protect themselves. And like you say, when in doubt, sit out. Yeah, so hopefully people will be taking heed to that so that they can prevent injuries and prevent, what did you call it? Like a double impact? What's the name of it?
Second impact.
Second impact, so they can prevent a second impact. Is there any additional statements that you would want to leave with our listeners or viewers for them to think about, whether they think they have a case or someone else has a case? I don't know. Are there any general thoughts you want to leave them with?
Well, we get a lot of information on our website. They could go to our website, www.brainlaw.com, and we have a lot of videos and a lot of useful information that people could take away from that about sports injuries and about sports concussions, as well as other ways that children and adults could get brain injuries, and the help that they should seek and what they should know about in some more detail, the signs and symptoms about a brain injury. So that would be a good resource, I think, for them as well. And when they go there, they could also find other resources on that site as well. But I think this has been a great conversation, and I thank you for allowing me to spend this time with you. And there's so much more that we could be talking about on this subject. So I hope that you'll allow me to come back again and we could continue this conversation.
Absolutely. And you're right. Like, we could spend a long time just talking about the law. And I think you are the first lawyer besides myself on this podcast. So I definitely appreciate you for the time and coming on here to impart some knowledge on our viewers and listeners. Guys, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of What Are You Sporting About? I am Savani DeBarros, protector of athletes. Until next time, we will check you later. Ciao.
Thanks for joining us this week on What Are You Sporting About podcast. Make sure to visit our website, prosportlawyer.com, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever your favorite platform is, so you'll never miss a show. And while you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes or iHeartRadio. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like the show, you might want to check out our book, What Are You Sporting About? Attorney Savania DeBarros is available for private consulting at sldebarros.com. And remember, we're here to educate, support, and guide you in your journey to success, because we're all sporting about something.